Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shakima Appleton, and I'm a volunteer on the Philly SHRM Programming Committee. We want to thank you for joining today's webinar entitled Why Moving from Policy to Practice is in the Best Interest of Your LGBTQ Employees and Their Allies. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce Elena Lumoser, Graduate Assistant Director in the School of Business at Westchester University, our annual sponsor.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elena. Thank you, Shakima. I am here to share some information about Westchester University's Masters of Science in Human Resource Management program and the AACSB accredited SHRM aligned top value and 100% online graduate program. First, you can complete your entire human resource degree in a 100% online class format, part-time or full-time, in 1 to 3 years. This 30-credit, 10-course program operates in 7-week terms, and we offer 5 terms per year. This means you can complete your classwork around your weekly schedule, around your work and family commitments. One 3-credit course is approximately $2,000, which means you can earn your entire degree for thousands less than at other comparable schools. The Masters of Human Resource Management program is accredited by AACSB International, the premier global accrediting body for business schools, and the program is also aligned with the curriculum standards developed by the Society for Human Resource Management. Students that meet prerequisites are eligible to apply for the SHRM Certificate Professional Exam in their final semester of the program. The degree does prepare you to advance within the human resource professions at the highest levels, with the curriculum focusing on compensation and benefits, employee and labor relations, ethics, global human resources, human resource metrics, leadership and change management, and workforce planning. If you qualify, you can skip the GMAT requirement, and our students come from all kinds of educational and professional backgrounds, not just business. This was a super short overview of our program, the MS Human Resource Management. Please do reach out with your questions if you have any additional information needed. The email is hrm@wcupa.edu. Again, that's hrm@wcupa.edu. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you, Westchester, for your sponsorship. During today's presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them via the question box on the GoToWebinar panel, and we will read them aloud to the speaker at the end of the webinar. We also want to remind you that you're eligible to receive 1 HRCI credit and 1 SHRM Professional Development credit for attending today's webinar. You will receive a follow-up email after the webinar with a survey link that must be completed in order to receive the certificate for your credits. Once the survey has been completed, the credit forms will be emailed to you within 1 week. All slides will be sent to all attendees after the webinar. Today's webinar will feature Stephanie Badalingo, founder and owner of Follow Your Heart, LLC. Thank you for joining us today, Stephanie.
Oh, thanks for having me, Shakima, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm sure that all of you are anxiously awaiting spring, just like I am, and most of us in the Northeast. Hopefully, that will actually happen starting tomorrow. But again, thanks for joining me. I will move through this information, move through the material. Fairly quickly. We've got some time. I do want to save some time for questions at the end, so that is clearly something that we'll plan for as we move forward. So let's just jump right into it. And the way I like to start this is really giving everyone kind of an overview of why I do this to begin with, because I just think that that's very important, that people understand kind of the genesis of all this for me. And for me, when it comes to LGBTQ acceptance in the workplace and workplace inclusion for LGBTQ people, especially those that are trans and gender nonconforming, I believe that it all begins and ends with education. And I think that, and you'll see as we move through the presentation today that education plays a pivotal role in moving from policy to practice. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Education, I believe, forms the foundation for understanding that which we do not know. And then it is my hope that from that foundation of understanding, we can build a house of acceptance. And I believe that, and acceptance can look very different depending on the individual. But I think that that is the progression that I hope I'll be taking you through today as we move together on a journey to full workplace equality. So that's really kind of where it all begins for me. And I think that as we move into the material today, I think there's some table stakes. And some of you may be in this place in your companies, some of you may not. But I think that the way things are now in corporate America and how we have progressed, the vast majority of companies, but certainly not all, have achieved a 100 score on the HRC's, which is the Human Rights Campaign's Corporate Equality Index, the CEI. I would like to think that the vast majority of you on the call today are familiar with that. You may not be, and that's okay. But I think it's also important that we're working from a foundation where chances are good you have EEO and non-discrimination policies that include protections for not only gender identity and gender expression, but clearly for sexual orientation. And that you may have established some measure of workplace transition guidelines. Now, if you don't have some of these things, that doesn't mean that you should get off the call. Oh no, please don't do that. But I think that it's kind of where we are today, and I think it's important for all of us to kind of understand that this is really kind of where we're working from. Okay, and what we're going to be talking about today is really about broadening the conversation. It's really about expanding the narrative. As you'll see in a few slides from here, I think that we have been in this policy creation phase for quite some time when we talk about LGBTQ workplace inclusion. And I think it's very important for us to realize that that's only really the first step. We need to move to practice. We need to understand how do we take these policies and imbue them into the culture of our companies. And that's really a lot of what we'll be talking about this afternoon. And I had the pleasure and the privilege to participate in a panel at the HRC's recognition event earlier this week for all the companies that have achieved 100, a perfect 100 score on the Corporate Equality Index. And one of the things I mentioned from the panel, and it's something that I've written about and has been published with respect to not resting on your CEI laurels. It's great that you have 100, and that's wonderful, but I think we always should be looking at, well, what's the next thing that we have to do? Because as we'll see, and as I kind of explain a little later on in today's program, the context within which we do our work is changing. There, clearly a multi-generational landscape is emerging. And as a result of that, we need to always be moving forward. We always need to be evolving. And we'll talk specifically about that as we go through today's program. A little bit about me. My name is Stephanie Battolino. I kind of live in two spheres, quite honestly. I am the founder and the owner of Follow Your Heart LLC, which is a speaking and training and consulting practice specifically tailored to transgender and gender nonconforming workplace inclusion. But I also do have a day job, and that's as corporate vice president at New York Life Insurance Company here in New York City. I have been there for 18 years. I transitioned on the job back in October of 2005. I cannot believe it'll almost be 13 years. And it's really out of that successful transition, because I was the first person that in the history of the company, and the company's like 173 years old today, I believe, that transitioned and in the workplace. It's out of that where and it went well for a company that had no protections or nothing. Now we are a 100 CEI company, but back then we weren't. And but it was never about my job, as it can so often be for many trans people in workplaces around the country. It was really about how can we make this transition as comfortable as we can for you. And it was really out of that, by leading them by the hand and creating policies where there weren't any, and guidelines where there were no guidelines, that I realized that this is very much a calling for me. It's very much about paying it forward and giving back. Because as I said to the HR vice presidents I was working with back in 2005, I said, I may be the first, but I will certainly not be the last. And it's important that we are prepared for that as we move forward. I'm currently on the board of PFLAG National. It's an organization very prominent in the LGBT community that has 400 chapters from coast to coast. Many are in the Philadelphia metropolitan area and in the Delaware Valley. I've served on the board, on boards for TILDEF, the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, the LGBT Community Center of New York, and I've been involved, for a number of years with Out and Equal Workplace Advocates. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Out and Equal and the annual summit that they have. I believe the last one was in Philadelphia. I've been a trans advisory committee member there for a number of years. So a little bit about me. But as I said before, the game is changing. Truly an intergenerational reality is emerging within the LGBT community. LGBTQ community, excuse me. And a lot of that has to do with the emergence of the millennials in the workplace. And I think they bring with them a completely different set of expectations. Those that identify as LGBTQ in that cohort, because unlike me, who transitioned later in life, and many like me in my generation, and I'm on the late end of the baby boomer generation, we were in the closet for a number of years, in my particular instance, for 4+ decades before I embraced my true self. And so in many respects, I was just thankful that I still had a job and that I can bring my entire self to work. For the millennials, it's a little different. They didn't grow up with that. Their expectations are very different. And that is why it's very important that we embrace the practical component of the policies that we've now created for LGBTQ individuals. By and large, the LGBTQ millennials embrace the notion of the gender continuum versus the gender binary. And what I mean by that is, and that could be a whole workshop in and of itself, but, typically in society, it's been about, males over here and females over there, and there's nothing in between. Well, that's not really true. And as a practical matter, it's very much a sliding scale. And, speaking broadly, LGBTQ millennials embrace that and look at it as more of a sliding scale, for want of a better term. And there's this wider emergence of gender expression where individuals can, express themselves in any number of ways. And I have a slide in a little bit that goes into that just in a little bit more depth. But where gender expression comes into play, it's always been a part, I think, of the trans community, because as we're creating policy to protect trans individuals, it was always about including language for gender identity and gender expression. So a lot of people, might wrongly think that, well, that's just related to the trans community. Well, in actuality, it's not true. It's really does apply to the LGBTQ community as a whole, because, for example, you may have a gay man, an out gay man in your workplace who chooses to express his gender in a very feminine fashion. By the same token, you may have an out lesbian woman in your workplace who chooses to express her gender in a very masculine way. And these might, and to the uninitiated, that might be a little jarring. But at the end of the day, that's what I'm talking about with respect to the wider emergence of gender expression. And I'm waiting for my slides to change. So why is this important to you? You might be asking yourself that question. Well, it's important for a number of reasons. And they're here on this slide in a nutshell, in my opinion, because it affects the whole enterprise. When you look at it from the front door all the way through to the back door of your organization, it starts with talent acquisition. It starts with attracting, recruiting, onboarding, and retaining top talent from arguably an ever diversifying pool of candidates. And that's only going to get more diverse as other generations age into their employment years. But you're not done with retention. At the retention stage, we're talking about once these individuals are a part of your organization, do they have access to the same career development opportunities that everybody else has? Do they have access to the same internal movement across job functions and divisions or departments within your enterprise? And that'll be a little different based upon the size of your organization, the culture of your organization. But at the end of the day, everybody has an opportunity to get the same slice of the pie. And that's really why this is all very important. Because as I've often said to companies that I've worked with, you might have someone who might be, for example, the most brilliant engineer that has ever walked in your door for an interview. And that individual might be transgender, for example, and may express their gender in a way that you're not very familiar with. So if you do not know how to interact with that individual and make that individual feel welcomed and embraced by your organization through that process, they're going to get up and they're going to walk out the door and they're going to go someplace else. They're going to go to your competitor who is more hip to the vibe, for want of a better term, and makes them feel like this is a place where they can bring their entire selves to work and contribute to the goals and objectives of the company. And that's really it in a nutshell. So as I've been saying, where the narrative has been in policy formation, a necessary first step, no question about it. We need to have that foundation, but now we need to move forward. This is where the narrative is going. And you need to be in the vanguard of that. You just need to be, because if not, you are going to be left behind. Because again, this is not a static world that we live in, and that's something that I certainly don't have to tell any of you that are on the call today. So it's really about moving from policy to practice. And as I said, it's all been about policy and procedure creation. And what I say is policy and process addresses situations. It's a very situational exercise, and I think it's very important that we do that, of course. But language and engagement addresses the underlying human interactions of your policies and your process. Policies and process are either on the cloud in your organization, or they're in a very dusty binder on the top of somebody's credenza, and they're not going to be put to the use that they need to be if you find that that's where they are. They need to be able to be brought to life, and that's where language and engagement comes in. And these are the types of things that we'll unpack as we go through this. So As I mentioned earlier, the journey to full workplace equality for LGBTQ persons doesn't end with a CE score of 100, CEI score of 100. It really is only just beginning. And the way we move from policy to practice, I believe there's three legs of that stool, if you will. I think there are three key elements that you need to be very aware of as you move forward. I think one of those has to do with cultural acuity. The second has to do with communication and language. And the third has to deal with continual education. Looking at the tops of the waves of each of these three, cultural acuity, the work that we do every single day in our companies is not done in a vacuum. It is done against a backdrop. And I believe that the primary backdrop that work is done is against the culture of your company. And we're going to talk about what are the elements of culture that if you're not familiar with today, hopefully you'll be a little bit more familiar with as we move forward to help you on this journey. Communication and language, without question, are key. I think that the lexicon that we use in the LGBT community has changed a great deal. It has evolved. There are words that people look at and go, I never heard of that word before. And we may run into some of these this afternoon, but it's understanding this language. And because if you do, then you'll be able to use it properly and communicate properly and make people feel welcomed and embraced. And then continual education. There's never not, and that's really a bad sentence, but there's really never, it should never stop. It's how you understand what the issues of the day are that are pertinent to the LGBTQ community or one of those letters within the community. Because if you understand where the issues are and what's happening in the world, that will help you, I believe, and you just in your overall approach to these individuals that are perhaps looking to work for your company. And I think, and this is not like a political thing at all, but we have to understand and accept the reality that with the change of administrations in Washington, the LGBTQ community took a pretty hard hit. Now, through all of my nonprofit work, I've really seen that firsthand. So a lot of the gains that the community has made over the years, some are trying to be rolled back and whatnot. And the fight now is stronger than it's ever been. It's truly a fight for survival. And that's part of the backdrop. And educating yourself on what's happening, especially if some of those things relate specifically to HR policy, it's important that you are doing your job from a very informed position. So when I talk about cultural acuity, I'm talking about having a better understanding of the culture of your company, and what, on a very high level, what makes up the culture of your company. It's its history. It's rituals and routines, its legacies, its legends, its symbols. And you probably know what all of those are in your company. All you have to do is get up out of your chair and look around, and you'll be able to see some of that. There's the stories that people tell. The things that we do. Like for example, at New York Life, we have a very interesting culture in this company. We are a mutual insurance company. We are not a public entity. Therefore, we are owned by our policyholders. And that has created a different culture over the 173 years that we've been in existence. And it can be very collegial, is the best way that I can describe it. Very unique, I think. And not that we've cornered the market on a collegial culture necessarily, but it's unique, for want of a better term. And so one of the things that we do, is we celebrate everything. And one of the things that we celebrate is on promotion day, and it's usually a quarterly exercise, but most of them are done in March when when salary treatment is done. And what's interesting is the individuals that get promoted, and of course this is all touted across the company intranet. The individuals that are promoted will bring in food. They'll bring in donuts. They'll bring in cookies. They'll bring in cake. They'll bring in crudité, whatever. And they'll have it set up in their cubicle or in their office because people come by to congratulate you on your promotion. And well, you want to have something there too, to entertain them while you're there. And I just think it's very interesting. And like I said earlier, I've been with the company for 18 years, and every year I just look at it and I just kind of shake my head and go, that is very interesting how we do that. But that's an example of a ritual that occurs in your culture and in our culture at New York Life. And I'm sure you have your own that you can think about. And before I move on from this slide, it's important that you understand, you live in this every single day. So to do these sorts of things and recognize these things, you may have to step back a little bit and kind of flip around and look back from the outside in to your culture. And that can be a little tricky sometimes. I get that. But I think that's what's interesting. So the next slide that I have is a slide that says, what is your organization's beta? And beta stands for belief, empathy, trust, and advocacy. And really what this is, it's about where are you in your company across these dimensions? With respect to your interactions with other human beings and how you do your work every day. Do you believe in the mission of the company? Do you have empathy for your colleagues? Do you have a level of trust in the work that you do with your colleagues? And does your organization as a whole advocate for other causes or for each other in the organization? And these are the kind of things I think that you can keep your eye on as you begin to kind of unpack your culture. I just wanted to stop for just a second. I had gotten a note that the slides are not advancing. Is that still the case? Would somebody like to tell me if the slides are advancing? Wow, they are not advancing. That is not good because they are advancing for me. Oh my. I do not know what's happening. Forgive me, I thought I was connected for some reason. I'm not sure why they're not advancing. Well, you'll all have an opportunity to get this presentation after I'm done, and then you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. The slides are advancing for me here in my office, in the room that I'm doing. You'll get the email. You'll get the slides in a thank you email. I sincerely apologize for that. I do not know why this is happening, because, like I said, these are advancing for me. So, with that, then I'll try to be a bit more descriptive as I go through these. And again, my sincere apologies. I think one of the things that you need to be aware of as you unpack your culture is, how quickly do you adapt to change? How quickly does your organization embrace change, and how quickly does your organization and how deeply does it embrace that change? And I call that cultural velocity and cultural elasticity. And you need to have an understanding of what that is, because what drives that is not only your business and specifically how you relate to your customers, and for that matter, your competitors, but what's happening around that and what shapes the speed and the depth of the velocity and the elasticity, respectively, is societal change, clearly the generational change that we've talked about. And then there's this thing that many HR people are very aware of, certainly D&I people are, and that's unconscious bias. It's embedded in the organization, and it could work against the elasticity and slow down the velocity of change in an organization. I think out of all of them, that could very well be the most critical one to keep your eye on as you assess the culture in your organization. So at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself the question, is your culture getting in the way? Is it inhibiting rather than enabling full workplace inclusion for LGBTQ people? In particular, I would add, transgender and gender nonconforming individuals, because it's that segment of the LGBT community where a lot of the buzz is today, and where it has been over the course of the last couple of years, 2-3 years, with the emergence of trans inclusive health benefits, fully inclusive transition guidelines, those sorts of things. So out of all of them, all the elements of the LGBTQ space, trans and gender nonconforming people are certainly at the front of the line these days. And I have a slide here that says, what does your D&I box look like? And what's on the slide is just a bunch of different shapes. And what I mean by this is only you know what the limits are of your diversity and inclusion initiatives within your company. You, in essence, know how far you can push the envelope. And what drives that recognition is the type of executive sponsors, perhaps, that you have in the C-suite, those that perhaps are the sponsors of the LGBTQ ERG, or just overall, is the chairperson of your company, the head of your company, one that's very much on a diversity and inclusion bandwagon. I think that, and that's going to look different at every company. And that's why the shapes look different, because no two cultures are really alike. They might be similar, but they're certainly not alike. And I think it's important for you to recognize that. Like, for example, at New York Life, we had a perfect 100 score on the CEI, 4 or 5 years ago. We have it now today, as I mentioned, but we lost it when trans inclusive health benefits came up as a requirement to keep your 100 score on the Corporate Equality Index. And quite frankly, we struggled with that. Much to my chagrin, we struggled with that. I don't think the company was ready to embrace it then, but we kept at it, using the LGBT ERG of the company as the fulcrum of that effort. And then finally it happened. Not so much because we wore down our senior executives, although there was probably an element of truth to that. It was about everything changing around what was happening in society at the time. And I remember walking up to our chairman at one of our large meetings that I manage, and his name is Ted Mathis. And I said, Ted, thank you so very much for making this happen. And he just looked at me and he said, Steph, the time is right. This was the time to do it. And I walk away from that exchange knowing that, the speed and the timing, it's going to be different at every company. You might be at a company, as you listen to this, that is kind of in that same place. And you just have to keep at it, because everything in their every company in their time is what I like to say, because each one has a different speed, and that's where that velocity piece comes in. So I want to move into the language component for a bit, and the slide that I have in front of me says language matters at the top. Well, of course it does. What do I say? You know, it's terminology, it's pronouns. How do I deliver it? Will you deliver it with authentic intent, mindfulness, and thoughtfulness? And let me just back up here for a second. What do I say? Terminology. I'm going to share with you some terms. Pronouns. People get messed up with pronouns. This is specifically with regard to the trans and gender nonconforming community. You know, I've had, when I came out, I had people say to me, "So what should I call you?" Well, call me Stephanie. Call me late for lunch. I don't care. Just, you know, whatever. But it's important that we get the pronouns right, you know. And so what I have made it a point of doing is making sure that people understand that I, as a trans woman, prefer she, her. Some people in the community will prefer they and them, which can get a little awkward in terms of sentence construction. And I was not an English major at the University of Delaware. I was a communication major at the University of Delaware. So so sentence structure, you know, I didn't do very well in that. But the bottom line is we need to be careful with our pronouns. But I understand that somebody may walk into your office for an interview, say, and you're going to look at them and go, I don't know how I should refer to this person. Well, and I'm hoping you're saying that with your inside voice versus your outside voice. But so here's the thing. When it comes to this language segment, I'm going to be throwing a lot at you, and there'll be terms that you may or may not be familiar with. But at the end of the day, if you let respect and integrity guide you, you're going to be fine, because all you have to do is ask. All you have to do is ask. And trust me, I have been on the other side of that ask, and that sends a very powerful message that you care enough to ask me how I should be referred to. What do I prefer? And that's very, very important. And when I look at the how do I deliver it section of the slide, when I talk about authentic intent and mindfulness and thoughtfulness, you know, put in another way, folks, do you believe in what you say? You know, we've all been in situations in our lives where people have said something to us, and right away you can tell by their tone, by their nonverbal cues, by their stance, what have you, that they do not mean what they are saying to you. And it's important, I believe, that we be conscious of that. And that's why language matters. I'm moving to another slide that I will urge you to look at when you get the deck after this session. And it's called Framing Our Language. And I think it's very important that you take a look at this. And what it does, what it has is it has 4 dimensions: assigned sex, gender expression, sexual orientation / attraction, and gender identity. First and foremost, when you look at this slide, this is not just about trans individuals. It is about everyone. It's about you. It's about me. It's about, you know, the guy you buy your lottery tickets from and coffee in the morning. Everyone has an assigned sex. Everyone has a gender expression. Everyone has a sexual orientation. And everyone has a gender identity. So what I have across the assigned sex dimension is male, female, and intersex. Now, intersex, long time ago, it's really seen as a pejorative term nowadays. Used to be known as hermaphrodite. Not anymore, of course. But intersex, that condition just means that there are internal and external sexual characteristics of both sexes present at birth. And it happens more often than you think. So there's that element of it. Gender expression can be masculine, can be feminine, can be androgynous, in the middle, a little bit of both perhaps. Sexual orientation, is either heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual, asexual, where you really don't have much of a attraction, if you will, to anyone. And then there's another term called pansexuality, where it's not where you are. I often say in training sessions, this doesn't mean that you're out on the street late at night looking to hook up with somebody, whoever they may be. That's not what it is. What pansexual is you are attracted to a wider range of individuals who express their gender in different ways and have a gender identity that can either be male, man, woman, or what have you. And that's what pansexual is. I think out of all the 5 that I have listed on this dimension, that may be the one where, people may not have heard much about it or are familiar with it, actually. And then gender identity, of course, it's your internal sense of self. It's either male, it's either a man, a woman, and then there is a non-binary gender identity where an individual may not necessarily feel particularly like a man or particularly like a woman. And if there is one concept that you come away from this conversation about framing our language, it's this. Know that gender identity and gender expression are 2 separate variables. They are not the same. Sexual orientation and gender identity. I'm so sorry. Gender identity is my internal sense of self. It's male, it's female. Sexual orientation is who I love, who I'm attracted to. That's as simple as that. Gender identity is who I am. Sexual orientation is who I love. But it's important that you understand these different dimensions because individuals that you will interact with in your workplace will fall into into various combinations of these dimensions. My next slide it's called a new lexicon. And I talked about some of these words. And typically when I do a training, we will go through a vocabulary exercise. And people are like, Stephanie, I have no idea what some of these words are. And I'm like, that's okay. This is how we learn. And we do it together and we figure it out. But some of these words that I have listed here, and it's just really a sample. Gender nonconforming. You'll hear also gender fluid. You'll hear, of course, transition. You'll hear intersex. You'll hear queer a lot. And it's interesting. I used to do some trainings with a gay man, and I remember he told the class one time. He said, queer is a word I had a lot of trouble with because as a gay man, I have been harassed by homophobic people using that word negatively. But really, it is now been embraced as a badge of identity for a segment of the gender nonconforming community. And they rally behind that term that I am queer. And you'll hear a lot about that. You'll see that in the popular in publications, what have you, out on the internet, what have you. There's clearly a wider emergence of that term in a very positive way that people are owning to self-identify. We've talked about gender identity. That's another term that I have listed here, transgender. The term cisgender is here. And cisgender, in a lot of the trainings that I do, that's the word where people go, now I haven't heard that one before. In a nutshell, cisgender means we had to come up with a word for not transgender. I mean, if you want to go back to the roots of the words, cis is from the Latin same, so same as, same gender. I work side by side with many cisgender women. Born a woman, born a female, has an internal gender identity of female. It's all in alignment, same as cisgender. Transgender, on the other hand, trans being the Latin for across, I believe, is clearly the opposite. I was born a male, but I was born male with a gender identity of female, hence transgender. And then there's other terms that I have here: cross-dresser, a larger segment of the transgender population that typically have an identity, an internal identity as male, but very much a closeted group of individuals. You may or may not know that you have any cross-dressers at your place of employment, because it's not something that they would ever imagine doing in the workplace. I also have here trans woman, trans man. You'll hear that a lot. It's just trans woman is a transgender woman. Trans man is a transgender man. And then sexual orientation, of course, goes along with gender identity. But these are just a small sampling of this lexicon that I'm talking about. And the last thing I'd like to say about language, and specifically as it pertains to the transgender community, is transgender is an adjective. Transgender people are not transgendered, as in the past tense. I am not in the past tense, I'm in the present. We are not transgendering, we are transitioning, and we are not transgenders. There's not a group of transgenders there across the street. It's a group of transgender individuals or people. And why is that important that you know that? If I'm sitting in a meeting with you and you say something like, well, yeah, there was a group of transgenders on TV the other night, I'm going to know that you're not, it gives you away. I'm going to know that you're not, you haven't either educated yourself or went through a webinar like this to understand that that's not exactly how you address transgender people. And that's why it's important, because it'll raise a flag for any transgender person. Now I want to, so I have a slide up here which just reinforces something that I said earlier. There's a lot of words here, and I'm going fast, and you don't have slides to look at, and all of that sort of thing. So your head might be swimming right now. But at the end of the day, if there's any doubt in your mind, just ask. Just ask. I've already talked about the importance of that, and I can't state it enough, because you don't ever want to assume anything. You don't want to assume gender identity. You don't want to assume sexual orientation. It will get you into trouble, and that's the last thing that you want to do. I have another slide up here now as we move into the final few slides here. The role of the LGBTQ ERG in your organization. It can and it should play a significant role in this entire process of moving from policy to practice. If you have a very vibrant LGBTQ ERG, it can be the beachhead, not only for newly transitioning or new trans employees, but for all LGBTQ employees. It's a place where they can, as they are learning the culture of the company and getting to know people, can know first that they are respected and welcomed and celebrated within the organization. The LGBT, and I co-founded the LGBTQ ERG here at New York Life. It's called Nile Pride and Lyle Pride, and first time we'd ever had it in the history of the company. And I have to tell you, it really has expanded and made a big difference in the business for the company, because it's a source of education for the employee population. There are Pride Month events. I get that, and joint events are done with other ERGs, and that's how people again educate themselves and understand better the nuances of the community. And then lastly, the ERG, if it is structured properly and has the right objectives in place, it can make significantly quantifiable contributions to the enterprise. What do I mean by that? Well, for New York Life, for example, we had not launched a target market for the LGBT community, but we did as a result of the work that the ERG did with our agency department to, you know, to define what the market opportunity was, to reach out to the field and to get them to understand that there was a significant opportunity. A number of our agents were already working in that community, but they weren't doing it in a structured way. And we were then able to attribute sales. At the end of the day, what was our contribution to top line revenue from the LGBT community? And we were able to actually quantify that. So that was a big win for the ERG. And that's what I talk about when I talk about quantifiable contributions to the enterprise. Got a couple of slides left before we move into some questions. And again, I have a continual education slide up here where we talk about educating yourself about the community, about the issues. And the best place to do that clearly is various sites on the internet that are quality sources of news for the LGBT community. And I can certainly share those links with you offline. Let's see. So at the end of the day, a lot of this happens because individuals that are not LGBTQ become allies of the community. I think that should almost be table stakes for everyone. It's important that you be a supportive and informed ally, colleague, and manager, that you use the appropriate language, that you ask when you don't know what the answer is or what somebody looks like. As I said earlier, let respect and integrity be your guide, because I will tell you this. It may not happen today, and it may not happen tomorrow or next week or next month, but you will find yourself as an ally being confronted with I'll call it a teaching moment, where you are in a meeting or with an interaction or having an interaction with a fellow employee, and they are saying something that is either not correct or perhaps, dare I say, hateful about the LGBT community. And that's when you have the opportunity to set them straight. That's where you can step up and be an ally with a capital A versus an ally with a small a. And that's where you can be a champion. And I have worked with companies that the largest group of employees within their LGBT ERG were straight allies. And that just warms my heart, because at the end of the day, we cannot do it alone. The LGBT community is merely a subset of a larger community, a larger population here in the United States. And we need the support of allies to move forward, whether it's with regard to workplace inclusion or something outside of the workplace. So I have a slide here with a big arrow and a big exploding advocate sign. And you move from ally to advocate when you do embrace those teaching moments, when you inform yourself. Prepare yourself for that interaction. Always be ready, because you never know when it might happen. And that you can be, oops, I'm very sorry. That's my timer. I have to time myself when I do these things. So it's about moving from an ally to an advocate position. And I think that is always going to be the key to guide your actions. I went to diversity conference a couple of years ago in Minneapolis, and Maria Hinojosa from CNN was one of the platform speakers. And I have on my last slide a quote from her, which I think is very apt, and it says, "Learn to see yourself as the person most unlike yourself." And I think that is the very much sums up kind of the guiding principle that I'm talking about, because you need to open yourself up to that experience. And I think if you do, then your actions will go in lockstep with that. So with that, I would love to, in the time that we have, and I think we probably have about 5 or 6 minutes, open it up to any questions from those that are on the call.
Okay, we will now open it up for questions. If you have a question for Stephanie, please type it into the question box at this time. All right, looks like we don't have any questions. I'm going to pass it over to Shakima to close the webinar.
Thank you again to today's speaker for taking the time to share her knowledge with us. Thank you to each of you for joining us for today's webinar. As a reminder, please look for the follow-up email with the link to the survey. Be sure to complete the survey in order to receive HRCI and SHRM credits, and visit www.phillyshrm.org to register for other upcoming events. We encourage you to check out the Philly SHRM website for updates on all of our upcoming programs. Our next webinar on financial wellness and the American Dream in 2018 will be held on May 10th. On behalf of Philly SHRM, thanks again and enjoy your afternoon.